Welcome, everybody. It's Tuesday, May 3rd already, and Gender and Judaism. Rabbi, please take it away.
Great. Well, thanks for coming back, you guys. Nice to see you. And we were just about to get into some actual text last week. So we had talked at some length about what word we might use for transgender in modern Hebrew, and I tried to make a case for Ivri, the same word that gives us Hebrew, and that sense of it's a dynamic word which talks about crossing over. But I want to go to the creation story itself and the creation of the human being, and take a look at some of the language there. So I won't start right at the beginning here. I want to start in chapter 2, verse 18 in the book of Genesis. So if you remember the stories of the very beginning of the Bible, the chapter 1 is essentially those 6 days of creation. And in chapter 2, depending on how you understand how the Bible comes into existence and things like that, we either have, as the traditional Jewish explanation would say, a kind of an amplification of things that have already happened in chapter 1, or as the biblical studies people would tell us, a second creation story. But in chapter 2, verse 18, we have the sort of beginnings of this question of it's 18 verse 19, I guess. So
Adonai said,
yeah.
Oh, yeah. Vayomer Adonai Elohim. And in the English says, God Adonai said.
Yeah. So lo tov hayot adam levado. It's not good for the human to be alone, right? It's interesting that I don't think anything else before this is lo tov, right? Everything before this is tov, or occasionally tov ma'od, either good or very good. God looks at the creation, and after each of the days, God says that this is good, right? But the first thing that's not good, and by the way, this is a topic that's much bigger than our question of gender and everything else that we're talking about here. The first thing in the world that's not good is loneliness. Right? I find that really striking and strikingly beautiful in a way, right? That's up till now everything was good, and here God, and the language for God is unusual. Here we have two names of God in a row, right? Vayomer Adonai, the Yud He Vav He, the unpronounceable name of God, and then Elohim, another name for God, which is the one that appears in the first, right, in the first verse of the Torah. So depending on how you want to interpret that, right? And this again gets us into a lot of other topics, but to understand that every single word in this section of Torah is both important and worthy of commentary. And I'm not sure we need to talk about Adonai Elohim in this context, but it's just worth noting that it's there. But so the first thing God says that's not good is for the human being, the Adam, right? So Adam is not really this character's name, not yet, but the human, right? In this case, the definite article before it, right? And so this is the human being that God has made. And we'll go back and look at one of the earlier texts about that in a little bit. But so this is the creature that, according to our tradition, is made B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, and is now alone. And so, and the phrase, right? I mean, it's translated here, a fitting counterpart. The older translations, I think, had a help meet. It's a rather peculiar phrase, right? I will make for him, or I will make for it would also be an okay translation. Ezer kenegdo, right? Which ezer comes from the root to help. Neged is a somewhat peculiar word, but it could be support, right? So make for this singular creature a help and support. So it's only later, by the way, that we get, it's not till the expulsion from Eden that we get this command to be fruitful and multiply. So it's interesting to note that the real the thing that God finds that isn't good, like I said, is loneliness. It's not necessary, that one of the arguments about these creatures in the garden is that as long as they were in the garden, they were actually immortal. And the idea of procreation doesn't really come up until the expulsion from the garden. So up till then, it's unnecessary, right? It's interesting that what God finds objectionable is loneliness, right? So there's not really, I would argue, not really a necessity to understand this as a gendered thing here, right? That God makes a wife for Adam, right? That's not exactly what this text says, right? So I think that's a valuable insight for us as we try and understand what our tradition, what our texts really are telling us about gender and about relationships and things like that. So I'd like to go back to the creation of the human being itself, which you'll find, I believe, in chapter 1, Vanessa, if you want to, I actually didn't write down the verse, but it shouldn't be too hard to find. Where is it? Verse 27.
I was just going to say, so chapter 1, verse 27.
Yes.
Okay, I can do that. Oh, okay. It only, oh, that's chapter, wait.
Yeah, back to chapter 1.
There we go. Here we go.
Good, right? So interesting translation here, a pretty progressive modern translation, I'd say, that we're getting here. And God created humankind in the divine image, creating it in the image of God, creating them male and female. So we just saw that the second human doesn't exist until chapter 2, right? So this leads to an understanding that perhaps the first creature, right, ha-adam, as the text calls it, the human, right, is made in the image of God, okay, male and female. And if you remember what we were talking about language for God last week, where we have masculine and feminine names for God, and we even have some names that are both male and female, juxtaposed, like what did we mention? El Shaddai. I don't remember if I talked about Av HaRachamim, Father with a womb, which is one of the names for God that we have. And of course, we have names for God like Creator and Rock of Israel that are not conventionally gendered at all, right? But so here we have this idea. So what does it mean to be made in the divine image? A goddess, if you like, right? A being that is beyond gender. So the first human is also beyond gender. And it's then in chapter 2 when God says it's not good for the this creature to be alone, then the second creature is created, and according to the story, out of the first. So it's there that the genders are separated, right, in chapter 2. So here we have one creature that is both male and female, right? And that would be closer to what we understand as the divine image, right? Whatever that means, you know. So we have this character, male and female, in the image of God, who's male and female. And so, you know, there's a question about why God creates us at all. You know, why God creates anything at all. I mean, why does God create the universe? And one argument might be that God creates out of loneliness, and because we're then made in the image of God, that existential loneliness is a part of us as well. And so God tries to answer that loneliness with the creation of the second human, right? So, but I just, going back to this thing, that the real problem here is loneliness and not procreation, so that dividing the creature into male and female could be read as simply validating human love and companionship in whatever form that takes, right? You know, it isn't automatically, right, that the thing you hear evangelicals say that it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, right? I would say it's not such a slam dunk that should be our understanding of this text, right? That rather what is clear is that human beings shouldn't have to feel lonely, right? And that companionship is important at whatever level and in any form that might show up. So we were talking last week about gender being on a spectrum, that gender can be fluid, and all of those kinds of things. And so whenever people find comfort in companionship with others, that might really be what these texts are teaching before they get to questions about procreation, which, as I said, really doesn't come into the picture until after the expulsion from Eden, at which point there comes to be a question of how do you propagate this a species, right? And that starts, I think, a long slide towards gender norming, right? And where that idea that you know, men must marry women so that in order to procreate. And by the way, once I often have said to people, those who think that the Bible says that marriage is between one man and one woman haven't really read the Bible, right? You know, it was certainly true that in the patriarchal system of the Bible itself, the marriage was between a man and any number of women, right? And that we also do have examples that appear to be examples of homosexual love in the Bible. I mean, most notably David and Jonathan, right, in those stories. So, I'm mostly arguing that I think even as far back as the Bible, the idea that that gender and sexuality come in a wide variety is already there in the text. We've just kind of ignored it mostly over these last couple of thousand years. So, but they've really been there. And to sort of prove that point, I now move into a section talking about ancient texts of Jewish law, Mishnah and Talmud, and you know, recognize that conversation was going on about gender 2,000 years ago in the Jewish community, and that it's perhaps more positive than anyone might think a discussion from 2,000 years ago about questions of gender might be. Point out that first of all, what is often referred to these days as intersex, what might have been called a hermaphrodite in previous generations. We know that this is a physical phenomenon that exists. Statistics suggest that perhaps as many as 1 in 1,000 infants are born intersex with physical traits that can't easily be classified as either male or female. In the society that we have inherited and live in now, that is problematic for society where everything has to fit into one of two boxes, right? So, for 1 in 1,000 people, it's not so clear which box they're supposed to check, which locker room they're supposed to go to, which bathroom they're supposed to use. If you buy a plane ticket, they want to know whether you're male or female. I don't really understand why it matters to an airline, whether you're male or female. But, every form that you fill out has 2 gender boxes, right? Textbooks have 2 anatomical diagrams. We have 2 different kinds of birth announcement, right? People have told me stories about, going into a store to buy a baby gift and they want to know, is it a boy or a girl? Because, so that the first toy is already gendered. So, but if you think about a time, a pre-modern time, let's say, right? So, what do we do with those infants that are born now, those 1 in 1,000 children? They're actually usually surgically assigned at birth, right? Some kind of surgery will be done in order to make that child fit into one of the 2 gender boxes, right? But of course, 2,000 years ago, that was not the case. And so so it was clear to the rabbis of the Mishnah 2,000 years ago that there were people who did not fit into a binary gender, right? And so there's language for them. The most common words in the Hebrew, one of them is actually borrowed from Greek, androgynous, which is essentially someone who doesn't look to be the gender of their genitalia, right? Or there's another term, the tumtum, which is someone of mixed genitalia, indeterminate sex, let's say, when you look at them. So those terms appear more than 300 times in the Talmud, right? So sometimes in connection to things that are specifically about them, and sometimes just in the stories of the Talmud. They're just sort of part of the makeup of society at the time. So, and in the Mishnah, in the section where it actually defines this, it says the androgynous in some ways is like men, and in some ways like women, and in some ways like both men and women, and in some ways is like neither men nor women. So and I will say that the Mishnah's primary interest in this is a question of mitzvoth, right? As a human being, as a Jewish human being, we are required to do certain mitzvot, right? And women are required to do some mitzvot that men are not required to do, and men are required to do some mitzvot that women are not required to do. And the rabbis of the Talmud, in their quest always to define who's supposed to do what, weren't sure what to do with this naturally occurring phenomena of the androgynous and the tumtum. So their question is, what mitzvot is the androgynous responsible for? And I find that interesting. Again, it's not a it's not the texts don't say the androgynous should be excluded from Jewish life, right? It's really just the opposite. It's the androgynous is a part of Jewish life. What are the rituals and the rules for the androgynous? I see Marilyn has a hand up.
13 mitzvoth to be multiply and to be fruitful. Is that not the first one of the 613 commandments?
Well, being first doesn't make it the most important to begin with. But as I said, a lot happens in the Torah before we get to it, right? Mm-hmm. So everyone agrees there are 613 mitzvot. There are a lot of different formulations for what they are. So I don't know that anyone starts with what I suggested, but that seems to be the first thing that God finds unacceptable is loneliness. Okay? Mm-hmm. So be fruitful and multiply. It clearly is important, right? It's clearly an important mitzvah, and of course we know now in the 21st century, that being in a committed same-sex relationship doesn't mean that you can't be fruitful and multiply, right? So, so to have that be the reason that the relationship of love between two human beings can't exist, right, doesn't make sense to us anymore. So I think you're right that it's usually considered to be the first of the mitzvot, but it does depend on who's counting and what you're looking at. So,
and then I had another question, Rabbi. Mm-hmm. I agree with you. I think if you weren't lonely, you wouldn't want or need a partner. So you have to be lonely first, otherwise you'd be happy by yourself. Mm-hmm. Which who would be happy by themselves? I mean, that would be exactly what God wouldn't want. But he had the angels. Obviously, he wasn't satisfied. They're static, and he needed people who, humans. So right. He wasn't all alone. And so that's interesting that the angels weren't satisfactory to him as partners.
Right. Yeah. And there's a lot of rabbinic commentary over the centuries about this, that because the angels' nature is unchanging, that makes them not like God, and human beings, because we can change, that's part of what makes us in the image of God, and so that's what makes us different, and why God needed us and not just the angels. But there's tons and tons of commentary on questions like that, right? Remember in the Torah itself, the word angel doesn't exist. That's later. The word angel comes from the Greek translation. God has messengers, but we shouldn't quite conflate those with sort of the later images of angels that come up in later texts, I think. Yeah, and so loneliness is an issue, but the answer to loneliness isn't necessarily even to have a life partner, right? It can be to have friends, to have community, whatever it is, right? So I think I wouldn't define it too much, in the box of right.
Well, just not being alone, not being alone. Yeah. I mean, you could have a pet, but that's not quite another. Right. That's a wonderful pastime and a good friend, but it's not another human person.
Right. So pets don't, lovely as they are, don't take the place of community. And what that might mean. So but I was saying, as the issue for the rabbis is not that the person who is intersex, the the person who is gender fluid, those things should be shunned or separated from the community or asked to live in the closet or anything like that. There is a simple acceptance that they exist, and that they therefore, as part of the community, have responsibility for certain mitzvot. And so what mitzvot are they responsible for? And in what feels like, a 21st century kind of answer, but is really the answer of the Mishnah. First of all, it says that people are made al yadei shamayim, by the hand of heaven, and every human, therefore, is a divine creation, made in the image of God, different as we are from each other in appearance and other forms, and therefore is entitled to be understood and included in the community of Israel. And so what mitzvot should they do? In the Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi says that the Androgynous is bria bifnei atzmahu, which is a really peculiar sentence. Really, grammar purists, right? Basically what this says is the Androgynous, he is a created being of her own, right? It mixes male and female pronouns into the same sentence, making the suggestion that the binary categorization of this human being is impossible. So all humans are in the image of God, all are entitled to be included. And this one, the Androgynous, is male and female, and not defined by the the gender norm, right? So what mitzvot should they do? They do the mitzvot that they think they should do. Is the basic, that's the Mishnaic answer, right? So someone who may be born of the male sex but of the female gender chooses which mitzvot are appropriate, and vice versa, of course. Certain things, certain biological things may not apply in certain cases, and therefore those, right? So a male-sexed gendered female is not going to menstruate, right? So the rules of nidah don't apply, right? But other rules that do apply to women would apply to that person, right? And that's essentially the Mishnah and Talmudic understanding of the Androgynous and the Tumtum. I think that in its somewhat odd way, because of course it's the primary concern, right? The thing that the rabbis were always really concerned about is, are the mitzvot being done, right? It may not be such an issue for modern Reform Jews, where we pick and choose, in a sense, among the mitzvot, right? The ancient rabbis were very concerned about, are you doing the things you're supposed to be doing, right? The mitzvot that are supposed to apply to you. So within that context, they're remarkably open-minded about this spectrum of gender and sexuality. So I find that really fascinating. That said, when we get to later stories in Torah, of course, we are going to find what appear to be prohibitions on homosexual behavior. This week we're reading Kiddushim, which, within paragraphs we have some of the greatest language of the Torah, some of the most beautiful stuff in the Torah. Love your neighbor as yourself, right, is in this Torah portion. Be holy, you shall be holy because I, Adonai, your God, am holy. Some truly beautiful language. But we also have the prohibition on a man should not lie with another man as he lies with a woman, right? Is also in this section of Torah, right? So we have some of the most glorious language and some troubling language in the same text, right? But I will say that these prohibitions have taken, first of all, I'd say they've taken an outsized role in the way, certainly in the way evangelicals look at the Bible, and to some extent the way all society looks at the Bible. So other things that the Bible prohibits, like mixing meat and milk, don't seem to get the same level of scrutiny that this question of a man lying with another man does. So what makes that, a prohibition for all time, where other things are just become an acceptable part of our everyday lives, right? Like cheeseburgers, for example. So I think that that's interesting itself. I mean, it reveals something about society, and that we're obviously much more concerned about this prohibition than we are about whether you mix linen and wool in the same garment, right? Which is also prohibited in this section of Torah. So it's so that tells us more about society and how society is developed, and it tells us about the Bible and what's actually in it. I talked about how babies these days are usually given corrective surgery, and I would say that this surgery is not for the health of the child. There's nothing unhealthy about being born intersex. Rather, the concern is how that child crosses over and creates a perceived threat to societal norms. So our concerns about what Leviticus says about homosexuality is all about societal norms and not about anything healthful for anybody. So and I think if you really examine the stories in the Bible, there's a couple of things going on here that are worth investigating a little bit. I mean, first of all, more often than not, the concern is not about a loving relationship between two men or two women. The concern is about rape, right? So even this prohibition in Leviticus that a man should not lie with a man the way one lies with a woman, right? As uncomfortable as it is to talk about this, right? One of the ways that a man acquired a wife in ancient times was simply to take her, right? To be blunt, you get your wife by raping her, right? So to take a man that way was considered to be a different kind of transgression. So the issue here is not a relationship that's forbidden, but a way of creating a relationship, right? Because I don't know how to put this other than to say that you weren't allowed to reduce a man to the status of a woman, right? That's what wasn't allowed. And of course, we find that awful today, but that's what the text is telling us, right? The language that's used here, it says to do this is a Toeva, which I'm not sure what the translation that you have, Vanessa, would say about this. I think it's chapter 18, maybe 19 in Leviticus. Maybe we can find it. I'm just curious to see what their more modern translation might
So
say.
you want chapter?
Let me see, Leviticus.
Okay. Uh-huh.
Start with Kiddushim and we'll see where that
Oh.
gets us.
Okay. Aria, Kiddushim. Here we go.
Leviticus, it's actually Leviticus 20, I think. Let's see.
Here, well, here's the adultery. This is,
So I mean, there's a whole bunch of things about sexual immorality.
yeah, man lies with a male as one lies with a woman. The two of them have done an abhorrent
Yeah, so they
thing.
still use that term. The
Yeah.
word in Hebrew is to'avah, and a peculiar word. It appears in a lot of places. Not every, at Yom Kippur we talk about al chet for the transgressions we have done. Not every transgression is considered to be a to'avah. What transgressions are considered to be a to'avah, right? So right above, committing, what would this be? Adultery or incest with your daughter-in-law is not a to'avah, okay? It's wrong. You're not supposed to do it, right? And you can see there's even a death penalty for it, according to this, right? But it's not a to'avah. So, again, our translators have made a certain value judgment in their translation of the word to'avah, right? So they have translated it as abhorrent. So is the thing in verse 12 there, is that abhorrent? Oh, I'd say it's just as abhorrent, isn't it? More abhorrent, right? But the word isn't used for that because that word is in general in biblical things related to a particular thing. It's actually related to idol worship. So to'avah is idolatry. So in this verse, again, say this doesn't say anything to do with a man loving a man. It has to do with a kind of a cultic prostitution, which has to do with idol worship. And that's why the word to'avah is associated with it. So one way of understanding it is everywhere the word to'avah appears, it is about idol worship. So yeah, I'd say what we don't have here is the example that we find around us today is people falling in love with who they fall in love with and seeking companionship where they seek companionship. So it's also interesting that in the commentaries in the Talmud, there's discussion about what the word to'avah means, and there they don't talk about idolatry, but they translated a rabbi named Bar Kapra makes a pun out of it. It's to'e atabah. The to'avah is something that leads you astray. So it's not an abomination. It's a wandering off the path, which I would argue is a much different connotation than abomination, right? And here it might be, as Marilyn was alluding to earlier when we talk about be fruitful and multiply, in a society that wasn't accepting of gay and lesbian people and marriage and so forth, the ability of men who fell in love to procreate was certainly not there in those days. So perhaps what Bar Kapara meant is that you go astray from the path of procreation, right? So, but it is, I think, it's a much softer understanding of the word Toeva than the way our translators have translated it. And speaking about the Talmud, so in all of the commentaries on things that are prohibited to Jews, there is considerably less mentioned about LGBTQ people than there is about a lot of other things that we're not supposed to do, including the laws of kashrut. Right, Marilyn, you've got your hand up again, I see.
Yes. I was going to say, thank goodness that Judaism isn't static, because today, if two males marry, they, and I know somebody where this is the case, and there are many cases like it, where their sperm can be given to a donor. And I know a family who both males' sisters donated their eggs, and each one fertilized the other mate's sister's egg, and they have two beautiful children that have their genetics, both male and female.
That's right. That's right. So those kinds of things are happening all around us. So the idea, which certainly did, look, prior to the ability to be involved in fertility in that way, in a medical way, right? This could be understood as separating you from the path of procreation. But now we wouldn't see it that way. So,
sure.
That's one understanding of that term Toeva. And as I said, I think it's just important to recognize that it's a much softer term than the word abomination would imply, right? So, as I was saying, this prohibition is mentioned less than others in our commentary, and that's intriguing. And there's a few, several questions we could ask about that. I mean, one would be, some people suggested that homosexuality was not evident in the Jewish community. I think that that's probably not true. I mean, it may have been more closeted, but the idea that it wasn't there and therefore doesn't get written about, I don't know. Conversely, you might go the other way and say, we didn't write about it being a problem because it wasn't a problem. Not because it didn't exist, but because it didn't need to be regulated, right? It wasn't a concern to the community. That it's a later development that we get this kind of this disposition to see it as a terrible thing, right? There may have been discomfort with the question, and so we just avoid it. I mean, that's certainly possible. Or it may have just, as I said, just not a big deal in the Jewish community. So, some people point to the fact that here in Kedoshim, it says this about a man with another man. It doesn't say anything about a woman with another woman, right? And again, so some people say, well, that's because there was no such thing in the Jewish community. That seems unlikely. So more likely is it wasn't troubling to the Jewish community if a woman fell in love with another woman. But also, of course, in a society where women didn't own their own bodies, and this is, of course, unfortunately, a timely thing for our community again, for the American community. In a society where women didn't own their own bodies, it didn't much matter to men what they said they were or what they did, right? Because men owned them anyway. Anyway, Sarah, see your hand.
Yeah, I had that was very interesting, your explanation of Toeva. These prohibitions against idolatry may have also been to set the Jewish community apart from idolatrous or other peoples that were living around them. And certainly the Greeks had a pretty accepting view in certain times of history for homosexuality and sex between males. So maybe this is also part of the making this an idolatrous prohibition.
Yeah, so the Bible predates that Greek influence a little bit, but certainly as time goes on, the Greek influence becomes very much a part. But in some ways, it becomes a part of Jewish tradition. And as I mentioned, the word itself, androgynous, is from the Greek, right? The word itself shows us the Greek influence on Jewish culture. So in some ways, we imitated Greek culture. Another word from Greek is afikomen, at the end of the Passover Seder, right? So in some ways, we imitated Greek culture, and in other ways, we wanted to separate from it. To the extent that Greece was equated with idolatry, we wanted to separate from it. In the ways that it was associated with culture and philosophy, we assimilated it. Right? So it definitely colors the interpretation over time of all of these things. There are other thoughts?
Sarah, did you want to say something else?
No, thank you.
Okay.
So,
Wait, Laura.
Yeah.
I think that's Laura Sauer.
Yeah, that's me. Hi.
Hey, Laura.
I'm hiding behind I have my camera off.
Okay.
I just think it's really interesting that what you're pointing to is looking way beyond human gender and at, I think, what God's intentions are, which is, looking at our relationships. And I never thought of those different rules as being, really applicable to what it meant to be a woman in that time, not so much what it means to be a woman in our time, or, that different rules were assigned to different genders based on what the culture in this society was, and that's not something that we need to look at now. Being a male now is not the same as being a male back then. And
Right.
I really love that perspective because, again, it's going back to what the relationship is and not so much, oh, well, I see the word woman here. I'm a woman, or I identify as a woman, so I must follow these rules. So I find your perspective fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I mean, and it's really something, it's one of the lenses we have to use when we look at Torah. And one of them is when it talks about the roles of men and women, we have to understand it in their terms as well as ours, right? So, you can't take a man and turn a man into a woman, is basically what this says. And clearly that's about power and status, much more than it's about love and relationship, right? Or about the physical act of sex, right? Rashi makes one comment about this. I don't know if I can remember it off the top of my head, but he doesn't go into all of these places. He just says, when it has this prohibition, it's the way you're prohibited from having sex with a man the way you have sex with a woman, which is like the way a paintbrush goes into a can of paint. So that's Rashi's whole comment on this section. So which would seem to open up a whole lot of other possibilities, I guess, that are okay. But I don't know. It's just it's very peculiar how little he says here, in a sense. A modern writer who's written a lot about Judaism and sexuality and things is Arthur Waskow. And Waskow talks about this as being how does he put it? He says, don't make love to a male as if he were a female. I'm not, you can probably interpret that how you mean it, but I think he understands that that people are different from each other, and so love is love, and you treat somebody with love not the way you think they ought to be treated, but the way they think they ought to be treated, right? So bringing it much more into a kind of a, what Rabbi Hillel said, what's hateful to you, don't do to anybody else, right? So we should love people the way they want to be loved. And that's a very different way of interpreting this same verse, right? So what I was getting at is that Toeva is this technical term used multiple times in the Torah in the context of idolatry. So whenever we see that term Toeva, one of the things we should be looking for is, how is this prohibition an idolatrous practice? And so that's something that we have to see there in that text. And then the last thing I'd say about these texts in general, and I'm sure some people would say, well, thank God we're Reform Jews and we don't have to take the texts that seriously. That we pick and choose in a certain sense, that we have the autonomy to find the mitzvoth that are meaningful to us and keep those and discard others. And that is the intention of the Reform movement coming from the 19th century. We should recognize, of course, that there are many Jews in the world who are guided by Torah, including Reform Jews. So we can't just dismiss it. But on the other hand, we have plenty of other things in the Torah that we have dismissed. And really, I think whether you're Reform, conservative, Orthodox, whatever stripe of Judaism you are, the Torah over and over talks about the laws of slavery, right? How it's okay for human beings to own other human beings, what our responsibilities are to those human beings we own. But there seems to be a complete acceptance, in a sense, in the Torah of slavery, right? This was a debate in the Jewish community in the 19th century in America, with some rabbis on the pro-slavery side because it was in the Bible, and others, great Reform rabbis like David Einhorn in Baltimore, speaking against slavery, that this is something from the Torah that needed to be left behind. So we recognize all the time that those pro-slavery texts in the Torah are unacceptable to us, that they, in fact, are abhorrent. And if you wanted to use the word Toeva as abhorrent about something, it would be those texts, right? So it's not the, it's not uncommon for Judaism to transcend the texts of Torah and change them and move away from them. So for us to take some of these things from Leviticus 19 and say they don't apply in the 21st century is very reasonable. And we actually have thousands of years of Jewish history to look at in terms of, as I was saying earlier about the Mishnah, that no one is to be excluded from the community. Nobody is to be forced into a closet. Nobody should be forced to live a life that they don't, that doesn't express who they are. And they should be encouraged to be part of the Jewish community and to perform such mitzvot as they find meaningful. It's an early kind of Reform practice, if you like, from thousands of years ago. So that's the texts on this. So we'll spend some time on Hebrew, I think, next week, about the project to deal with gender in a gendered language. So thanks very much for coming today. I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Unbeknownst to you, perhaps a little commercial, because Rabbi Evan's going to be doing during the summer a whole session on Judah Benjamin, who United States Senator from Louisiana, and I'm sure was all for slavery. So he will, it's going to be an interesting session. You have to wait a couple months, and I think that's it for my announcements, because I made some at the beginning. So
as long as you're on that subject, if you get a chance to see, there's a new documentary called The Levies of Monticello.
Oh,
Which is about the family that owned Thomas Jefferson's house, Monticello, for longer than the Jeffersons owned it.
Wow.
90 years they owned it before it became a National Historic Site in the 20th century. So from the 19th century into the 20th century, and some of them were slave owners as well. So it's a very interesting documentary. I just happened to see it at the Northbrook Library last week. So
okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's good to see everyone. If you do have to miss a Tuesday, we're recording all of them. Just see me and I'll send you the link. All right, great to see everyone. See you this week. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Rabbi.
everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.